Welcome to the Fly Fishing Insider Podcast, where each week we speak with brands, icons, innovators, and trailblazers within the fly fishing industry, exploring both the successes and failures they've encountered along the way to become who they are today. But first, if you have not yet subscribed to the podcast or joined our email list, please do so by going to the flyfisherinsiderpodcast.com, or you can also find us on Instagram at flyfisherinsiderpodcast. Now let's begin. Welcome to the Fly Fishing Insider Podcast. Today our guest is Captain Joel Dickey. Yes, he is back. We brought him back from our other show that we have called Guided, sponsored by Scientific Anglers, which airs on Fridays. We brought Captain Joel Dickey back just due to the response that you guys have sent me in the outpour or inpour or whatever you want to call it of content and messages regarding his episodes. So how could I ignore that? So I brought him back. Captain Joel Dickey, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing good, Greg. Thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, I like to say we're excited, but we are excited. I have not received so much direct messages and messages from when you did that episode, and it was only 20 minutes long. So I'm like, you know what? That's why I reached out to you again and said we need to expand on this. So, and I know we've been talking about it, and here we are. So let's talk tarpon.
Absolutely, my favorite subject.
Yeah, I bet it is. So, you know what, Joel? Right now you're guiding out in Florida. Is the tarpon season started there yet?
Yeah, right now it's the fish are starting to come in.
Mm-hmm.
They're starting to come to the backcountry and lay up. Now, obviously, when we have it's pretty early. Okay, so it's very subject to weather. And generally, this time of year, what they'll do is if we get a cold front, those fish will get pushed back out to the deep water, and for a couple of days, and then what they'll tend to do is as soon as that cold front passes, and the north winds stop, which is what brings that cold air and down, and drops the water temps. As soon as it goes back to easterly wind and brings the warmer air back up and starts warming the water back up, which, believe it or not, only takes a couple of days.
Yeah.
Those fish, they'll move back up into the flats, and this time of year is great for the laid up tarpon fishing, and that's what they do because truthfully, they're just really starting to get back down into down in South Florida. They're getting, they've been pushed by the cold, by the winter, down to the, southern part of Florida, and they're generally out in deeper water. And when the flats start warming up, they kind of start to pour onto the flats, laying up.
Cool. Let's take it to the level of like the basic level here. So if someone wants to, let's do an introductory into tarpon fishing, right? So what makes the species so unique? Let's talk about getting, what you would need to get started into tarpon and where we would target them essentially. We'll start from there and see where we go. How's that sound?
Sounds great. I think, if you're a beginner and you want to, dip your feet into tarpon fishing, I think the biggest thing is, being able to cast, without thinking about it. Does that kind of make sense? Because a lot of times, you get guys that they come down and you can really watch them as they're really trying to not, mess up. So they're really thinking hard about their cast and everything. And I think the biggest thing that what guys really need to do is especially if they're changing over from trout to
Yeah.
tarpon fishing. Uh, get you a bigger rod. Start casting with that bigger rod, because there is a big difference between going from a 5 weight to a 10, 11, 12. Start getting used to casting that bigger rod. Granted, the muscle memory for forming your loops and everything is the same, but it does take a little bit more power, a little bit more getting used to doing that. And they really, like I say, they focus more on the cast. A lot of times, what I should say, they think more while they're casting, and I think it's better if you go out in your yard, practice a little bit, set up targets. What I always tell my guys is go to Home Depot, go to the artificial turf, to the carpet section, buy you some like 6x6 pieces of artificial turf, cut it, to 4 places, paint you a little circle in the middle of it, set up 4 different spots, say it like 40 feet, 55 feet, and maybe 60 feet. You don't really want to go beyond 60 feet. That's, I'll be honest with you, if you're casting much further than that, it's more just not needed. Okay. But be able to hit, after you paint the circles with spray paint, be able to hit those spots, without thinking about it. Just, learn to shoot your fly to those targets and get comfortable with it, where it's second nature, to where, okay, we got to, because a lot of times when you're, I'm up there guiding and I'm pulling the flat, and it happens pretty quick. Okay, we got fish coming in at 50 feet, and if they're already at 50 feet, that's depending on their angle, okay, more than likely the cast is going to be, 40, 45 feet, so you can cross that fish as he comes towards you. And I think being accurate at those distances is going to help you more so than being able to cast really long distances, okay? Being able to cast those distances in a couple of back casts from what we call the ready position, which is basically fly in hand, standing on the deck of the boat, 2 or 3 back casts, lay the fly out, get ready to strip and fish the fly. I think that is the most important thing, is being able to hit that target and do it quickly. That's the biggest thing that I find that guys, but back to my point, what I see them do is they start thinking about their cast, they start watching their back cast, and that's really, you really don't need to be watching your back cast, because once you turn your head, you're not keeping your eye on the fish, and the fish is moving generally, and you lose track, and therefore you're going to blow the shot,
Actually, that's really good advice. Yeah, I'm just picturing it. Really good advice.
Yeah. And when you're practicing also, matter of fact, I had a guy 2 days ago. He came up, he's coming to the Keys. He wanted to fish me. I was booked already, so I've set him up with another guy. But the thing, he we spent an hour, and 40 minutes of that hour was basically casting from the ready position at certain distances at 40 and 50 feet, and that's what we worked on pretty much 3/4 of the time that he came up. And so, because it's going to be first time tarpon fishing.
Sweet. And how was, okay, so let's look at that. So here's a guy, first time tarpon fishing, came to you, got some advice, you set him up, you walked him through the drills. How was, within the 30, 40 minutes, like how did his cast improve? Was he hitting the targets? I know not everyone's going to be able to do that, but on average, was it successful? Would you say he's going to be successful heading out there, or has a really high chance of?
Well, after, and basically what I would do is like, I would get, 50, 60 feet from him,
Mm-hmm.
and I would just start walking. I'm like, all right, here I come. Here's the fish. Lay the cast out in front of me. And, the first 2 or 3 times, believe it or not, guess where the cast landed? It was behind me. So, I mean, guys, and what had happened was he had practiced so much, and, he's relatively new to fly fishing, and, he had practiced so much, and he had gotten used to looking at his back cast every time.
Yeah.
And even in that situation, when it's a lot less pressure, okay, he would, the first few times he missed, and eventually it got to, after the first 2 or 3 times that he missed, he was like, okay, this has got to be a lot quicker, and then he started to get it, and he got it to where, he could hit it 4 out of 5 times, so I think, if you're going to come tarpon fishing, whoever you come tarpon fishing with, call and talk to your guide. Ask him what, the type of shots that you're going to be making.
Mm-hmm.
And in reality, and I think we talked about this on the first show, there's really and truthfully, there's what I would consider really 3 different times during tarpon season, and each of those 3 times is kind of a little different than the other, at what's expected of the angler, what I expect out of the angler, and the types of shots that you're going to make. So, and, when you do come and just discuss that with your captain, and, figure out like, hey, what percentage of shots are we going to be making? What's the high? It's what type of shots are we going to be making the most of, I should say. But that would be, your best bet. So.
Yeah, I agree. Joel,
Yeah.
I totally agree with that. I mean, reaching out to, you don't just go on a trip blind, right? So doing your homework, reaching out, asking your guide, asking or the company or whatever you're going through to ask, to get that knowledge, and, same with line selection and everything like that. So for sure, that's why you're there, was a part of the service that you're offering, right? You do want people to be successful and enjoy the fishery. So.
Yeah. And, believe it or not, as I've taken a lot of people through the years, and a lot of times I kind of just go through, certain scenarios, just for the simple fact that through the years, I've noticed how guys don't ask. I don't know if it's, they're afraid to or whatever, but don't ever be afraid to ask your guide what you should expect. If they're worth anything, they will explain that to you thoroughly. That's just my opinion, but I would think that, that they would be, spend 15, 20 minutes on the phone with you, and, kind of explain, what they expect of you. And every guy's different, Greg,
of course, right.
Some guys, they, like to pole more than others, and get you in that absolute perfect shot, case where if you're right-handed, 10 o'clock at 50 feet, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's the other important thing, knowing the clock of the flats boat, get kind of familiar with that. Make sure that, when you're with your guide, understand where his 10 o'clock is, okay, and adjust to his 10 o'clock and adjust to when you ask and this is obviously when you're on the boat with him, tell him, ask him to point out 50 feet, because his 50 feet might be different than your 50 feet,
Mm-hmm.
I find that's very common, especially when you've never been with the guide. And I think that is why it's very important that when you do find a guide that you like, stick with him, because over the years, the relationship that you build, it's more of a team thing. And, when he says, 50, 60 feet, 9 o'clock or 9:30 or 10 or 11:30, you know exactly how far he's talking and exactly where to look.
Yeah, you guys are working together, right? So
Yeah, exactly. And I'll tell you, um, the first day that you go, you know, you're going to kind of get what I call the wild eye. Guys kind of panic a little bit, and when you first call out that first shot, first 2 or 3 shots, 9:30, whatever, 50, 60 feet, guys they're it's like their eyes are in panic mode and they're really looking. What I always tell my guys, point your rod, um, and move it very slowly from left to right. I'll tell you where to stop, and that's exactly where you need to look. Because guys make the mistake. They move the rod from left to right, and if
mhm.
they move it 2 feet really quickly, at 60 feet they've covered 100 feet of water.
Yeah,
And like I say, they get that panic and they don't see the fish a lot. So just calm down, breathe, and eventually you'll start to build that relationship with your captain and your guide, and it's important that you stick with that guy over the years, and stuff like that is just, it's like breathing. It's secondary. you know Guy calls out the distance and time, exactly where he's talking about, and you've made the shot.
cool.
So
Definitely good stuff as well, Joel, for sure. And like you say, it's like you're working together, right? So, and you got some great tips in there. So, I did have one of our listeners on the last show write me or DM me on Instagram, and they asked about the hookup. They wanted me to ask you about setting the hook for tarpon. And they were asking about that, and I don't have that message anymore, but I remember that. So if you could walk through the setup and how you're setting that hook, and I know you're not trout setting it, so
yeah,
you know.
well, you know, and there is a general answer to that, Greg. But there are different occasions, okay, that and different scenarios that can pop up, and I will kind of explain what I'm talking about.
Mhm.
In the Keys, generally speaking, guides are going to be using one-aught hooks, and essentially what I always explain, and when I get a guy on my boat, for the first time, I generally walk him through from, even when we get to the flat, from getting his rod, stepping up to the bow, stripping out his line, making a clearing cast, and then stripping back in and grabbing what the ready position is. And after you've made the cast, and we're going to get to the hook set for now, as you're stripping, okay, there's a couple different scenarios where now, um, you know, guides are going to, depending on the time of the year, you're going to have guys where you're, single hand stripping very slow, and now there's a lot of the double hand stripping or the striper strip, uh, where basically you're tucking the rod underneath your up in your armpit, and
Yeah.
you're constantly stripping, and they're all different. Well, I mean, they're not different. They're the same basic, concept. But the biggest thing that guys is what I tell my guys is the rod tip needs to be completely into the water. Okay. And the reason for that is when the rod tip is in the water and you're stripping, you are in direct contact when that fish eats and turns. All right. And so think about it. If your rod tip is 2 feet above the water, even though when you're stripping, when you pause, you're going to get slack. The line drops straight below your tip, correct? So there's slack there. All right. As long as you keep the tip of your rod into the water, which is the most important thing, you're going to be in direct contact with that fish. All right. Now, depending on how aggressive that fish eats, and I'm going to kind of go through a couple of different scenarios here. Let's just say we're single hand stripping now to the fish. All right. And rod tips in the water. You're slow stripping and the fish eats. All right. But he continually swims toward you. You obviously have to continue to pick up the slack, which means you continually keep stripping. All right. Because if you try to set the hook right there, you get in a position to where a lot of times what guys do is they strip all the way back as far as they can, but they don't get the slack completely out of the line, because you got to remember, some of these fish, their mouths are, you can fit basketballs inside. Okay. The fish, it doesn't feel the fly in there, so it continues. When it sucks it in, it continues to swim at you. All right. Well, what happens is when you strip very long, obviously I want you to strip very long, but I want you to make sure that you're going to get tight to the fish, because if you don't get tight to that fish on that first strip, what guys do is they'll strip the one time really long and they don't get tight to the fish, and they'll just kind of hold it there. Well, now the fish has traveled another 4 or 5 feet, and now they're slacking the line, and the fish ends up spitting the hook. So what I want you to do is, as soon as you feel tension to where you think you've stuck that fish, immediately take your stripping hand, get it behind and strip again. Continue to stay tight to that fish, because if you don't, he's going to spit it. It's going to taste like fur and feathers versus a shrimp or a crab or, menhaden or something. So, so that's if he continues to come at you. What we like to see is when the fish eats and turns away from you. Okay. Well, when the fish eats and turns, say at a 90-degree, perpendicular from the path that he was swimming, a lot of times when you make that long strip to come tight to it. Now, stay tight to him, all right? Because now he's going away from you, all right? Now, there's going to be a very fine line, all right, from just holding on to the line and staying tight and letting line go, but with enough tension that hook stays in place. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay. Because a lot of times I see guys, they make that initial strip, fish as the fish turns and, after he's ate and then he's turned and they hold. And when they hold, you know what's about to happen. You're about to get broken off, okay? But if you make that long strip and you come tight to him and you hold it there just for that second, just to give him a little bit of a stick,
Yeah.
and then as he turns and he kicks a couple times, you're kind of holding that with enough tension to where it's staying stuck, but line, when he really kicks to really go, line will then, go through your fingers, and then at that point in time, you're going to go through the process of clearing the line, and then once he gets to your reel, what I generally like my guys to do is keep the rod low,
Like
and
in the water still?
hitting. Yeah, keep it low. Yeah. Well, it's not in the water. Generally, you're a foot above the water at this point, because as that fish is taking line, it's going to bring that rod tip out of the water. I promise you, because the tension alone is going to, Now, as the fish goes away, and when it gets to your reel, as soon as it gets to your reel, drag only, okay, using the drag, you're going to want to hit him a couple more times, just like low and away, 1, 2, pointing the rod at the fish, but keeping your rod tip low, just 1, 2, 3 of them up, making sure that what you're driving, what I call driving that hook home, popping that hook inside the jaw. And now once you hit him 2 or 3 times, generally speaking, he's good until he either, jumps and lands on the leader and breaks you off, or, something crazy happens, and which is what happens all the time. I mean, it's once you hook a tarpon, a lot of times it's hard to keep butting to them, longer, to where they're close to the boat anyway. So it's, we try to get them to the leader, and pretty much at that point, that's a landed fish.
Yeah, for sure.
For
sure it is.
So,
that's,
but, and now when you're double hand stripping, the hook set is, once again, keeping the rod tip in, staying straight. This can be like a fire drill real quick, because now you got to think the rod is up underneath your arm.
Mm-hmm.
And once you hook that fish and you stay straight to him, you continue the strip, he goes away. And as he's going away and you're kind of clearing line, you basically want to drop that rod into your right hand if you're right-handed, and if that's your casting hand, I should say, drop it into your casting hand and then clear the line. A lot of guys miss that one on the first time doing that, and it's better if I actually would have could show it versus talk people through it. You know what I mean? Get their guide, let their guide, kind of show them how to do that. If the guide's wanting them to two-hand strip the fly to them, because that's it's one of those things where it's better just to be shown.
Joel,
that's kind of a little like.
If that's an invitation, Joel, for me to come down there and film you doing that, then challenge accepted for sure. So.
Sounds good to me.
No worries. I did also want to ask about for tarpon. I want to talk about your leader set, like the leaders and your setup for that. I know we touched base in the last episode about that, and you have a custom leader system that you kind of created. And when I reached out to you again, I said we need to talk about that, because there's some interest on that, especially as well for myself as well for my trip. So I know you do a leader system. If you walk us through and the reason why you do that, in a nice basic level, I think that would be great and solve a lot of questions that were asked as well.
Okay, well, I mean, so basically, non-IGFA legal leader. Okay, mm-hmm. I mean, this is a general all around leader. The most important thing is when you're creating a leader, obviously the clearer the water, the longer the leader. Okay. And in the Keys, obviously we have gin clear water down there. I start at about 12 feet for the leader. Okay. And what I mean by that is this. Okay. So we have a 12-foot leader. I'll say 12-foot leader, and then, 18 inches of bite tippet. Okay. So we're pretty close to 14 foot at that point. Okay. And the way that I generally rig my leaders is this way. 60%, I call it the 60-20-20. All right. 60% of your leader should be your butt section. Okay. 20% is basically your step down from your butt section, and then 20% of what, if it was an IGFA legal leader, class line. Okay, which is basically your weakest point in between your bite tippet and the rest of your leader. So 60%, you're looking at about 6 to 7 foot of butt section there. Okay, well, about 7 foot of butt section. Yep. And the reason that is very important is because when we're speaking in terms of tarpon, we're generally speaking 11 and 12 weights. All right. And we're talking, generally speaking, it's going to be windy conditions. And what that does is that 60% of the leader as of your butt section is going to be, so like on the absolute hard mono, if I'm rigging my 11 weight, all right, and I'm rigging it to my Grand Slam, like 11 weight Grand Slam line, all right. So I generally use either 50 or 60 pound hard mono, all right. And the reason I do that is because of diameter, all right. That diameter, that hard mono, is basically just a hair step down in size than what the fly line is. And the reason that we want that is the transfer of energy from the cast to the leader is a lot more efficient if you use smaller step downs. That make so you don't want to rig up a rod, put a really small butt section where you got this big flat, fat piece of fly line, no matter what size it is. Mm-hmm. You're generally speaking, you're going to just pile up your cast. So, and when I use that 50 pound, I go to, either 40 or 30, and from the 40 to 30 to 20 to 25 pounds. And then I tie on my bite tippet or shock tippet. A lot of times people call it, but it's really a bite. That's what you're protecting them from, is the rubbing. But 60-20-20, then your bite section. That's and that's the other, and that's kind of another tip for guys when they do go out and they buy leader material.
Yeah.
Make sure that they that they buy the same leader material, okay? Because if you look at the leader material itself, there's generally a pretty close change in diameter from 50 to 40 to 30. You know what I mean? So essentially, you're going to get a pretty close, a nice gradual step down, so that that will transfer that energy from your cast to the fly, and because that is the other most important thing, is that is that fly needs to land straight. Your leader and the fly needs to land straight. So the second that you strip,
You're hitting.
You're moving the fly
Yeah.
and not trying to pick up slack.
Yeah.
So,
and that's why you're using that hard mono as well. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That hard mono is very key to that too. Because you're in tropical situations, it does not go, spaghetti on you.
Yeah.
And the other reason is when you're talking tarpon, especially sight fishing for tarpon, hard mono floats higher. And the flies we generally want higher in the water column. So that's also important.
Perfect. And you know what? I'm glad you brought up the flies because that was my next topic. I had some questions asked me about flies. People wanted to know what type of flies to pack for a trip, what type of flies tarpon are predominantly attracted to or successful at hitting. So,
well, I tell you, a lot of that's going to depend on where you go. In the Keys, early in the season, really and truthfully, shrimp and bait fish patterns. Early in the season, from like March, April, toad patterns work good during that time. And then when May rolls around, you'll see a lot of captains. They'll turn over to the worm flies, or smaller shrimp patterns or smaller crab patterns. I'm sure there's still guys that catch fish on bait fish patterns, but that's not really my favorite. But I would definitely, shrimp is anywhere you go in the world, shrimp's going to work. Okay, shrimp pattern's going to work. Toad is going to work. But like I say, May, you're looking at the worm pattern, and I'm referencing the Pololo worm. That's what May is famous for in the Keys. And it's when it gets like that, you're going to smaller patterns. And then later in the season, say late June, July, you can go back to shrimp and crab patterns and the bait fish patterns. Because the worms really, those tarpon really key in on those worms, come May and, early June. That's their, some biologists think that that's one of the reasons that they come to the Keys is because of the Pololo worm.
Interesting.
So
just a good food source for them that they're hidden. What is the migration of the tarpon within your area? Like, were they walk us through that?
Well, so I guess this kind of references back to, there's really three different types of tarpon fishing, that you can do in the Keys. Basically, you got early season, you have a lot of laid up fish. That's basically where the fish that kind of come in from the deep water, they lay up in the backcountry. Whether it's, single fish laying up, or sometimes I've seen as many as 10 or 15, laying so high in the water column, their fins are sticking out and they're just not even moving. And, yeah, it's pretty cool to see that. And as end of March, beginning of April rolls around, those fish, they start to kind of move from, the backcountry. You'll start seeing more on the ocean side. And then they'll form big groups when they do make that transition. There's always going to be fish in the backcountry. But for the most part, fish are migrating now. And when we say migrating, look, they're moving from, you know, from place to place, but a lot of times as you see them migrate, I really and truthfully think that's a part of pre-spawn where they start to group up in larger groups.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously the more the merrier, and they gain more fish as they go, as they hit certain channels, and then they move to the next channel, and then they'll maybe, grab another handful of fish out of, that's in that channel. And, and then, they, this is the time of year, that May, where you see, I know you've seen pictures of daisy chaining fish. You can go on my Instagram and you can look at, some of my videos that I put up there from, in May and June, where those fish they're really packed tightly together. Sometimes I've seen as many as 200 fish in one school, and they're just packed, tight as they can be, like fish stacked on one another.
Like a tarpon bait ball?
Yeah, I call them meatballs. That's exactly what I call them. And here comes the next meatball,
yeah.
and get ready. And I really like fishing to those, because it's you got 200 pairs of eyes that are actually looking up, which can be a double-edged sword, because you have 200 pairs of eyes looking up, and if you make a mistake,
you spook
that's
them.
yeah. So and then basically what you see around the end of May, 1st of June, they really start to they'll go offshore and they'll spawn. That's a lot of times that's when we have the Palolo worm hatch. I think that triggers them to spawn. Just like any, basically in out in the wild, a lot of protein, it triggers, breeding or spawning. And apparently those little Palolo worms, it's either a lot of protein. I always called it catnip for tarpon. And it triggers them to spawn. They'll go out to the reef. They'll do their thing. And then once they do that, essentially you'll start to see fish really exiting the keys as far as migrating fish. All right. Now there's still a ton of fish, and I see migrating fish all the way through July.
Mm-hmm.
But they just, it gets, as you can always tell when you're on the the downhill side of that, because those schools that were coming through that were 50 to 150 count, they're now down to 20 to 30, and maybe 5 to 10, and you get a lot of singles and pairs. And I mean, you still get plenty of shots, but you can tell, a lot of those fish, they're up on the east coast of Florida. They're moving up around the west coast, up around, Chapaleski, Tampa, making their way towards Apalachicola, and, in June and July. And so, that right in there, you can tell that those fish are starting to move at that point. And then you kind of come into late season tarpon fishing, which a lot of times the fish are not as big. Okay. There's still a few big fish around. I'm not saying that there's not, but there's still a lot of the tarpon that you see from that point are resident, and they're the 20 to 50 to 60 pound fish. You're going to get that 70 to 100, 100 plus fish, but more than likely, it's going to be the 20 to 50 pound, and which can be fun because that late in the season, that's when we get, a lot of topwater tarpon action. Early in the mornings, they're rolling, they're busting, we call them shrimp hatches. It's really not a shrimp hatch; it's a shrimp dive. Is what it is because it's pretty hot now and there's no oxygen in the water, and so the shrimp come to the top and they start, gasping and flipping, trying to gather oxygen, and
Tarpon just come up.
The good old king.
Yeah.
Yeah, the good old king comes in and he has a all you can eat buffet.
Yeah.
And it's those types of mornings when you find those things happening, it can be really fun. I mean, you can hook a lot of fish. And that to me, those are the most fun. Those especially those 50, 60 pound fish, because they really go nuts. And they don't kill you when you're fighting them. So
no, it's
and that's kind of
anything topwater is always fun, right? I agree with
yeah,
that.
absolutely.
So, Joel, we've covered the your tippets. We've covered where to find them. We've covered food sources and flies. We've covered technique. We've covered setting the hook. We've covered the migration and where to find tarpon. What else would you say we're missing in those topics for basic tarpon fishing for any listeners out there?
Well, I guess, boy, that's there's so much that, to be honest with you, Greg, that we could talk about, and I could talk for a long time.
I know. I'm only giving you an hour.
Yeah. I guess, we could talk about the gear,
Yeah.
As far as, what you would need and what's most important.
Yeah. Let's talk about it. What do you need and what's most important? There's the question.
I think that obviously, when you go to pick out a rod that you are comfortable catching or casting. Obviously, every guy, behind the counter, he's going to tell you, oh, you're going to want this rod because, that's his favorite rod.
Yeah.
What I would tell my guys to do, or your listeners, is look, if you go into a fly shop and they carry, 3 main lines of fly rods, you need to cast all 3. And you need to cast all 3 with the same line and the same reel, okay? Versus, the guy's like, oh, this is the best thing out there now. Well, yeah, for him, it might be. But as you know, everybody has a different casting style. Mm-hmm. Well, that rod might not match up to your casting style. And make sure that you get a rod that you think feels good to you and not who's trying to sell you the rod. I think that's one of the most important things. I get guys, they get on the boat and they're, oh, the guy at the shop said this is the greatest rod, and I'm like, well, did you cast it? And they're like, no. I'm like, well, well, okay. So, and he, no matter what brand it is, and then I, of course, me being a TNT advisor, I'm like, well, here, you need to, cast it up against this TNT and see which one you like the most. And, and it's funny how a lot of times they
lean towards
another
rod. Yeah. I mean, it's like buying a car, Joel. It's like buying a car without test driving it, right? I mean,
exactly. you can't do that. And another thing that kills me is to save time. The guy, when he goes and when you do ask to cast all three, they'll put you 3 different lines on 3 different rods. Well, that doesn't help you because if you have a overweighted line on this rod, then you have a a true to grain weight line on this rod. Mm-hmm. That's not the same comparison. No. You need to switch them all and cast it with the same line in each type of line that the guy gives you versus just casting a rod with this line and casting another rod with a different line. Yep. That's not comparing the two. That's comparing what he has stuck on there, The next thing is reels. When you're coming to salt, absolutely, this is one of the most. This is the most important thing in the reel and the line, because that reel is. If you get a reel that's not built for salt, it's going to fail. Okay, and you got to remember the saltwater. That is the harshest conditions that you can put any kind of equipment in. Even if you wash it, it does not matter. You got to find a reel with a proper drag. There's a lot of reels right now that are made that, to me, I have tightened them down as far as I can possibly tighten them down. And a guy will hook a big fish, and that big fish, it still just tears through that drag like nothing.
Just melts. Okay. Does it just melt it or what?
Well, it's basically the drag is there's not enough tension in the drag. Yeah. And there's a lot of those, there's a lot of those reels that are sold that, I'm going to kind of sound that, that are made overseas that, mm-hmm. Hey, this is a little cheaper, well, it might be a little cheaper, but you're really, cheaper is not better. Okay.
It's a little cheaper until you got to buy 2, right, Joel?
Exactly. it is a little cheaper until you buy 2 of them. And not to mention, let's think about it. You just spent $5,000 to go thousands of miles from your home, okay? And then you're going to, and the $5,000, that's just for the guide, okay? Now you got to spend, for your hotel and your food and everything else. And you get down there, and since you were, being cheap on your reel and the fish of a lifetime, you just watched it swim to Cuba because you don't have a good enough tag on your reel. Yeah. And, I'm a Sigler guy with the leader drag. Great investment. You will only buy one. And that I think the reel is extremely, extremely important. Lines, don't just go down with one type of line. You don't go to the golf course with a 1 or 3 wood and play golf with 3 wood. Yeah. You got to have the total thing. If speaking for SA, have a Grand Slam line for when it's windy. Have an infinity line for when when it's a little calmer, and maybe even the bonefish line especially if you're bone fishing, because those have a really that bonefish line is true to grain weight, has a much longer taper, and all these things can make all the difference in the world for your experience. And yes, it's not just marketing. It actually will help you catch more fish. And this goes back to when you go tarpon fishing, you got to talk to your guide. ask him what he wants, because it's just like you're going to Costa Rica,
That's right. And for the record, we reached out to our guide and we asked him, because I also talked to you as well about it. We've had a private conversation where I phoned you. I'm like, hey, I'm going here, man. Like, walk me through it. I mean, you're stupid not to go to someone that has been there and does it. You know what I mean? If you were coming up here to do Stillwater, you would reach out to me. It's the same thing, right? Like, yeah,
exactly. And I mean, like you're going to Costa Rica. Well, if the weather or if the conditions are wrong, you might not be out back in the lagoons fishing for those fish. You might actually have to be out in the mouths of the rivers.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, you're going to have a sinking line.
The sonars, yep. That was something that we're bringing for that reason. So,
yeah. And it's just really important, having the right line, because if you don't have the right line, it's really and truthfully, it's going to make all the difference in the world. Don't, make sure that you're over prepared. That's it. I have been all over the world, and the one thing that I hate is getting there and not having exactly what. And I have done that several times, Greg. And at that point, after doing that 2 or 3 times, this dummy here, he figured out, you know what? Maybe I just need to call and figure out exactly what they want, and then, as opposed to just setting up the trip and then just going, and hoping that I have hoping that I have the right stuff,
makes a big difference. That's for sure. So, I mean, it's difference between success or non-success, right? So, and I mean, with the time and the money, in some people's case, the money investment, like, you need to do it. And besides, you're going to phone and you can form that rapport with your guide and your guide. So if a guy phones you and says, Joel, I'm coming to see you in June, blah, blah, blah. And like, you already know that the guy's going to be pretty serious, and you got a good indication as to what's going to happen, right? Like, that's what you want.
Exactly.
So, it tells the guide the same thing. Like, hey, he's serious. He's here. Like, he's, so you're going to form that rapport. So for sure. Definitely good advice. So, Joel, what else do you got to touch base on here for equipment?
And I will say this too, and this is from experience. A lot of times, your leader material, tie your own leaders. And I'm going to give you a really quick example of something that happened to me. And I laugh at it now, but I really didn't think it was funny when it happened. Be able to tie your own material. Be able to tie your own leaders. Make sure that you have the leader material that you need. Because sometimes if you go into the fly shop and just buy a leader, there's no telling how long that leader's been there on the shelf. And you got to remember, a lot of times that leader, it's been there on that shelf. It's been, exposed to UV light because, it's right there on the wall, right next to the big, window. And I tell you, I bought a leader one time, my first trip to the Keys, and I bought a tapered leader, and I was with my buddy Bruce Chard, and we were going to the Marquesas. It was my first trip to the Marquesas ever, and we're going permit fishing. The conditions was absolutely beautiful, and I asked him what kind of, he hands me a fly when we get to the first flat, and he goes, how about your leader? I go, oh, dude, I just got a leader. It's okay. I'm good. He goes, you sure you don't want me to tie? I said, no, man. I said, I got it. It's good. And I was still a trout guide at this point. And, and sure as the world, 5 minutes into the flat, here comes 2 tailing permits. Beautiful big fish. Yeah. Lay a nice cast out. I strip one time. the lead fish, which is generally the biggest, eats. Off to the races we go. 5 seconds into, I mean, literally, I didn't even have the line cleared. And I hear this. It sounded like a 22 go off.
Pop.
And Bruce is like, holy cow. He goes, dude, you got to let go of the line. I go, dude, I had barely any tension on the line whatsoever. So now here's the prime example. We put 15-pound fluoro, okay, as an extra bit of tippet. You know, I always cut off about 6 inches up and, thinking that I'm getting, the bad stuff off. And, I tied on a, couple of feet of, fluoro, get it back. And you know where it was broke? It was broke 6 inches from the fly line in the butt section. Okay.
Just from being old and crappy.
And it was just old.
Yeah.
And I had bought it literally the day before at the fly shop, there in Key West. And it was, it was kind of a, I was fit to be tied. And then that's why I say it's always good to know all the knots that you need to know.
So Joel, for any listeners out there, to make it even easier, do you have any videos of you tying leader?
Yes, I do.
And those are on your site?
They're believe it or not, they're on Gink and Gasoline.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yes.
And there's several knots that I'm tying on there. And that is, yes, there are videos there of me tying leaders and tying knots.
Perfect.
And
I think that's the best way of doing it. Just sending
exactly.
people there, check it out. Your leader system's there. They can, I mean, you're the guy that helped with the absolute, line or, leaders. Sorry. And, take it from you. Right. So and coming up, here in about a month and a half, we're going to be filming some leader tying videos for SA, and I'll be tying them. And if so be looking forward to those because those will be coming up. Perfect. Then I'll just I'll make sure I'll just tag SA in the in our show notes as well because I'm sure they'll have it on their system as well for where you guys are tying. So I think that's definitely pretty good. So. Joel, you know what? It's never enough time, man. There's just never enough time to talk tarpon. So I want to send people your way. Cause I think, if you're into tarpon fishing and you want to book a trip with Joel, definitely, I want to send them your way. So where can they find you? What can they do? How can they reach you? All that fun stuff.
Well, the best way to do it, so you can DM me on Instagram. It's CaptJoelDickey, all together. It's at Captain Joel Dickey. And you can go to my website. It's CaptainJoelDickey.com. You can shoot me an email through that. You can. That's the best way. You can always catch me on my cell. 305-619-7769. Those are the best three ways.
Perfect.
And if you even just have general questions, shoot me an email. I'll try to answer them. Just remember, guys, tarpon season is started. Don't get mad if it takes a few days for me to get back to you. So
that's funny. I'll make sure I put all that in the show notes, Joel, all the way to contact you for sure. So, all right, guys, listeners, I want to thank you. Hopefully this answers many of the questions that you sent him before and doesn't open up too many more new ones. Otherwise, we'll have to bring Joel back again. Or you can, like I said, or like Joel said, reach out to Joel personally through the points of contact. So, Joel, I want to thank you. Listeners, I want to thank you guys as well. Thanks, guys.
And Greg, Thank you for having me again.
Yeah, no worries.
Look forward to it.
You've been listening to the Fly Fishing Insider podcast. If you like this podcast episode, please let us know. Leave a review and subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast listening platform.